This is called the informal city. There are 5 conditions of informality, according to the United Nations. And when you hear the word informal settlement, you should think of the other term that historically has prevailed, which is slums. In order for something to be a slum or an informal settlement, it must have most of the following 5 conditions. That the land tenure, which means my rights to occupy this land, is insecure, getting right to the DeSoto argument. The second thing is the house that I build on that land, I built. It wasn't provided by the formal sector of contractors and mortgage loans, bank loans, and building codes. It was a self-built home. The third one is poor infrastructure in general, access, electricity, and the fourth one is poor sanitation, an absence of sanitary sewage treatment that works. And the fifth one is water supply. It doesn't have a secure water supply. But at the same time, I want to point out that we live in a bizarre situation in the United States. In the United States, there are three sets of land rights. There's the one that is associated with the American dream, which is fee simple ownership. Fee simple ownership means you own it, you are the master of that property, and you can sell it. The second one is a hybrid, which is condominium. It's the newest of the group. You own everything up to the backside of the sheetrock, and then the condominium association owns everything else. And then the third one is rental. You don't own it, but you, through your financial contractual relationship with the owner, you have land rights. So this is about land rights. There are 3 forms in the United States. Excellent question for the next exam. Is the 5 things and the 3 things. In the rest of the world, they don't have 3 things, they have 36 things or 23 things. But property rights are different in the rest of the world. The people who live in these slums in Caracas have land rights. It's just not fee simple ownership, and there's varying degrees of security. This is a project by one of the alumni of the program, which is one of my favorite images of all time. Community Design Studio in 2009 focused on a slum neighborhood in Petare Norte in Caracas, Venezuela. And Cheryl Bratsos proposed this vertical connection, this library water collection scheme, to connect the slums of these steep slopes, which is often where slums locate, up to the former mansion, beautiful modernist house that was built before the slums developed. And they had this natural barrier. This is now owned by the municipality, and it's a cultural center, but it's disconnected physically from the neighborhood. And so her proposal was to produce this library that has an elevator that serves as a connector between the community and the house. Remember this? Of course you do. The 10 million person world has and is in the process of suddenly and dramatically becoming the 10 billion person world. Most of that population in the 10 billion person world, 95% of the population growth yet to come will occur in the cities of the developing world. We are currently at 7 billion humans. 1 billion humans live in slums in the developing world. The next boom, as we move from 7 billion to 10 billion, that number will grow to 2 billion living in slums and potentially 3 billion living in slums. It is, for all intents and purposes, the only growth that will occur in your lifetimes. The only growth of global population is going to be in the slums of the developing world. The slums are not fun, thus the name, thus the image, But it's not horrible. It's not absolutely horrible. The reason people move to these slums, one could take, and many people do take this approach, the reason the slums are not a sign of failure, they are a sign of success. These people have choice, they have free choice. They move off the rural landscape and they move into cities where they have access to jobs, social opportunities, sporting events, culture. They have the right to the city. And the right to the city is a fundamental term that is increasingly the focus of architecture and urbanism. Zenobia is giving a presentation at MIT on the 20th, April 20th, and it's called The Right to Architecture, which is a shift away from the right to city argument to a right to architecture argument. But the reason people move here is because of opportunity. And this is the home of the new entrepreneurial energy of the new middle class. And sometimes it operates quite well. Paul is probably familiar with this. These are the informal settlements of Indonesia, the kampung. People live here. Arguably, they do not meet the 5 standards because they have existed for so long. They have developed land rights. They have developed access to not quite sewage, but potable water. All water must be boiled before consumption. But there are businesses here. It's actually quite a complex interrelationship of businesses and homes. It's mixed use. In a way, it's exactly what Jane Jacobs would have approved of. This one study from an Indonesian student doing her research in a Dutch university did a mapping project of a kampung in Jakarta and looked at the interrelationships between the homes and the businesses and identified these symbiotic relationships that you get when you don't segregate between housing and income earning activities. I can take care of my kids even though I'm selling things out of the front of my house. My neighbors can come over and watch the store while I run an errand. There's a very intertwined social network. People take care of each other. When I lived in the kampung for 4 years, I lived in the house of a wealthy doctor. I rented a small place, a small room for $13 a month and ate my meals for 30 cents a shot and had a fantastic life. And I was part of the neighborhood. When the neighbor's husband broke his arm and could no longer work and wanted to keep sending their child to school, she does what people do, is we go door to door and say, listen, I'm really sorry to bring this up after the 3rd cup of tea. She says, my husband broke his arm, and the right thing to do is for me to give her $10, which is a fortune. All of a sudden, her kids can go to school. And that's what happens in the kampung. There are social interactions that works in place of a safety net, of a social welfare system. It's organically or in an emergent form. The physical conditions, don't be confused, this is not utopia. There are mosquitoes, I got dengue fever, there are waterborne diseases, there's a lot of misery, there's lack of access, so there are a lot of problems, but it is not horrible. And some would look at it, and some people fall in the extreme camp of Rem Koolhaas, who would say, look how chaotic it is, isn't it fascinating? And it's all cool, right? But that's, I would say, is an irresponsible position. There are fascinating positive things about it as an emergent phenomena, but there are also very negative things that need to be addressed very directly, and architecture is a big way to do it. Urban agriculture. This is a well-developed kampung in Jakarta. Some people have gotten wealthy and stayed in place and built their three-story concrete house, while others have just stabilized their situation. And some people don't like the social interaction of the compound, so they move to housing developments. If you're ethnically Chinese, you would be forgiven for abandoning the city because of the harsh racist attitudes towards the Chinese. Whenever there's an economic disruption, the solution is to express your frustration by murdering, burning, raping your Chinese neighbors. So it's not crazy to get as much money as you can and move to a gated community. And the city of Jakarta is a hodgepodge of this type of situation where the traditional neighborhoods gradually give way to the formal economy developments. And I'm going to just move from that to more of these juxtapositions. Now we're in Venezuela of formal and informal. The informal settlements tend to be on steep slopes. Lining the major streets are the more formalized and more affluent and more well-established economic activities. The wealthier people tend to live closer to the main arteries. And then the further back you go, you get people who arrived later to the situation and whose situation is probably less favorable. All housing is steel-reinforced concrete frame with brick infill. When you go and work in this booming market in the developing world, don't offer them wood frame houses. Wood frame houses are for peasants. They are inadequate they are socially unacceptable to the vast majority of the population of the world. So this is kind of the dramatic juxtapositions between the formal and the informal. So I think I'm going to drop it there, and or let me see just a few more. This is a shopping mall in Jakarta last summer, where the security guards will let you in or not, depending on their judgment of whether you are a hooligan or a legitimate consumer. Are you a member of consumer society? Are you a member of that 5% of Indonesian society that are consumers? Or are you a member of the 95% of the Indonesian society that do not have the discretionary income to be a consumer? Things happen like high schoolers will pool their money. Someone will go to McDonald's and eat a meal and save the paper bag, and that paper bag will become a status symbol. High school girls will pool their money and buy a nice shirt, and then it's kind of a cooperative arrangement where it rotates. Susie gets it on Tuesday and Betsy gets it on Thursday. And there are strategies for finding ways to enter the social, cultural life of consumer society, even though you don't have the money to do it. And of course, I'm going to end with this example where quite an interesting building, B+ in a junior studio, but it's in this situation. And the meaning of this changes completely from this framing, which is the architectural record framing of the building. This is what we're trained to do as architects and architectural photographers. That's the architecture. And we're trained through the education process to say this has nothing to do with architecture. But that conclusion, that point of view, has been questioned and found dramatically wanting. And Palestine-Israeli segregation of even the roads. And where's the picture I'm trying to get to? The Tower of David in Caracas, a wealthy developer abandoned his luxury tower and is now occupied by squatters. So an example of high-rise squatter approved by Hugo Chavez and the government of Caracas. The optimistic viewpoint of modern architecture was that art design could lead the way of modernism, of granting the greatest benefits to the greatest number of people. Jane Jacobs called into question whether modernist top-down planning was capable of delivering on that. And this was confirmed often. This is the example cited as the end of the modernist optimism was when the towers of Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, we've mentioned it before in this class, there seemed to be nothing that could be done with this architecture, that the problem was the architecture itself. The only solution was to demolish it. And of course, that is not true. The architecture is not the whole story. And this is the last slide. I'll continue this. I'll try my best to do this. But this is last year's Venice Biennale, where really this is their job is to curate the direction of architecture. And they said social engagement, the social purpose of architecture, is back. It was abandoned with the failure of public housing in the United States, and we're back. We need to solve problems as a society, and architecture and design is one of the most powerful tools for solving those problems. Design cannot do it on its own, but it's a very powerful tool to bring into play in the face of these problems. Okay. Informal settlements continued. The Venice Biennale announced to the world that architecture was ready to tackle the world's problems in a more serious way. That design was not quote-unquote autonomous after all. It actually does have a role to play as a force for solving actual everyday problems for real people in the real world, just as it had back in the 1920s and earlier with the early modern movement. One of the places where this had a running head start was in Latin America. Despite the fact that cities have faced serious problems for a long time all over the world, somehow Latin America is where the sense of urgency reached the design community earlier, and they started to respond with serious interventions. One of the prominent people that has to be credited with launching this to a large extent is Jamie Lerner, an architect in Curitiba, Brazil. He, in the 1970s, entered a design competition for the transformation of his city. He leveraged that experience into a successful run for election as mayor of the city. And in the process, he invented what we now call the bus rapid transit system. The idea of the bus rapid transit is that his city was not wealthy enough to afford a subway or even a light rail surface streetcar line. He found that for a fraction of the price, if a subway costs $10 million per kilometer and a light rail system costs $1 million per kilometer, a bus rapid transit could be done for $100,000 per kilometer and achieve close to the same performance in terms of numbers of people transported in a single hour, similar to light rail streetcars like the Green Line. The idea is that you enter the station and pay your fare, and having already paid your fare, when the bus pulls in, people leave and people get on the bus, and it's much faster. The other idea is that the bus has its own right-of-way. That means that 2 lanes of the street are reallocated away from private vehicles and reserved for the exclusive use of these buses. And the buses are then made much longer so that they come close to the carrying capacity of streetcars. Now, these buses can also expand in terms of their frequency of service. So you can start with one of these buses every 20 minutes, and then as demand grows, you can expand it to once every 10 minutes, once every 5 minutes, once every 2 minutes, etc. You can see the turnstile at the end of this station, this boarding station, and so you kind of get a sense of how it works. And here's how it looks on the street. So it takes Especially at the stations, it takes up the same kind of right-of-way space as the Green Line does. Um, this has been replicated all over the world, including in Boston. You know it as the Silver Line. From Curitiba, Brazil, we move on to Bogota, Colombia, where Enrique Peñalosa ran for governor of the city. Some cities have mayors, some cities have governors. He was offered millions of dollars, of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of loan and technical assistance to install a freeway system in his city, anticipating the inevitable growth of car usage as the society became wealthier. The Japanese have made this a very successful franchising operation, pyramid scheme, some would call it, going from city to city, offering them vast amounts of money to expand their roads in the hope of selling them cars down the line. Japan itself has wisely refused the similar efforts of the United States after World War II and said, no thank you, we'll use rail. We do not have the space or the resources. We do not want to cripple our economy by becoming automobile dependent. But as a way of stimulating their own automobile manufacturing, they have helped many, many other nations across the world in the past 50 years to cripple their economies by becoming automobile dependent. Enrique Peñalosa said, thanks but no thanks, we'll take the money, but we are going to end automobile usage for private means in our city by restricting it, not letting it grow. It will actually shrink, not end it, but they're going to shrink the usage of automobile usage in their city by imposing a odd-even day. If your license plate ends in an odd number, you can use it on Tuesday and Thursday. If it's on an even number, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, etc. And so, campaigning for governor by bicycle, he transformed the city with a system of bike trails after he was elected, and replicating the success in Curitiba, he installed the largest bus rapid transit system the world had known up to that point, called the Transmilenio system. Elsewhere in Colombia, Sergio Fajardo, who was a mathematician trained in the United States, ran for election in the city of Medellin, Colombia. Yes, you've heard of Medellin, Colombia. It is the home of the Escobar drug cartel, or was the home of the Escobar drug cartel. It was the location of the highest murder rate in human history that peaked in 1992 in the course of the military pushback against the drug cartels. The drug cartels were pushed out of Colombia's cities and into the countryside, and were further military victories aided by American assistance demobilized many of the drug soldiers who had been trained how to shoot an automatic weapon when they were in the 4th grade, and now they were returning to the cities after demobilizing the drug wars. They were returning to cities like Medellin, and they didn't know how to read, but they knew how to shoot really well. So Fajardo had to quickly come up with a way to take these young men in their 20s and 30s and give them something to do, give them an alternative to a life of crime. The yellow dotted line at the top is the murder rate. The yellow line is Medellin, and the red line, the other lines are other cities in Colombia. Medellin had the highest murder rate in the world, as I said, much higher than the others. And somehow, when it declined more dramatically and faster than any other city because of Fajardo's efforts. Fajardo's father was a famous architect and hung out with many other architects who for decades had been working on an idea of transforming the city through infrastructure and services devoted not to the wealthiest 5% of the population, as was the tradition and conventional custom everywhere else in the world, but instead identifying the communities with the greatest need and giving them the highest quality standard of public facilities. And so the transformation of the downtown realm through design excellence led to a series of projects. This is the equivalent of the Museum of Science a public space filled during the day with school children, designed by Alejandro Echeverri. This is a quite famous project, probably Medellin's most famous project, the King of Spain Library. And you see the Metro Cable, the metro cable system. It's part of the mass transit system. Before Fajardo came to office, Medellin had developed an idea of expanding the subway system up the steep slopes to service the wealthiest neighborhoods in Colombia, of Medellin, Colombia. And after Fajardo's election, he reallocated resources to serve the poorest communities of Medellin. And so this system was already designed for the wealthiest community. The strategy that Fajardo employed was to take a map and put a pin in the map every time a dead body was found. So it was the corpse mapping of Medellin, and if you stand back and squint your eyes, you can locate the highest density of pins and corpses. And wherever there were the most corpses, that's where you build the highest quality architectural interventions. This neighborhood of Santo Domingo won the first round of most corpses, and so it was transformed with this transit system and this King of Spain library set into a park. It's called the Library Park. It is a kind of new building type that combines library and park, but about a dozen other things, with special emphasis on educating young men and women to empower them to go into business rather into crime. This was a bridge between two neighborhoods. When they would fight their drug wars, they would throw the bodies in this ravine, and they were mortal enemies. The bridge, the process of designing and building the bridge, became a process of truth and reconciliation between the two communities in which they could develop closer ties, and now is a vital linkage for connecting the mass transit system of the Library Park, King of Spain Library, and the sports facilities off to the right. The King of Spain Park itself follows all the rules of static object-like formalist bad architecture, but somehow it still works because its symbolic punch is deployed towards making this community feel proud of itself. It has been featured in the New York Times travel section as Medellin has become the most attractive tourist destination in Latin America. The King of Spain Library, as I said, is kind of a self-contained box punctured with windows. One of the worst strategies for designing architecture, but somehow it still works. Partly it works because the space between these blocks creates a welcoming vantage point that people can occupy. The otherwise inhumane architecture somehow gives way to allowing people, in spite of itself. The program is, in a way, much more important than the form. Set in the neighborhood itself, it is not a walled-off piece of architecture. It is the living room of this community. Children that used to be locked and hiding under their beds for fear of stray bullets cutting through the house and their bodies now freely walk about and come in here and surf the internet. It is a place for education and training, getting training on how to manage household finances, how to manage a bank account. It is a source of great empowerment, and the space around it has become a very active plaza for selling things. The neighborhood itself, the housing has largely been untouched, which is a dramatic break from decades of practice of world development, where the assumption from the highfalutin Westerners giving aid to these poor brown-skinned people was, of course, they're suffering. Look at their houses. Their houses are horrible. Let's bulldoze their houses for them and build them nice new shiny towers like we did for public housing in the United States. In a dramatic rejection of that approach, Fajardo and his team said, let's just leave the houses as they are. Maybe move a few people out of harm's way where the flooding occurs, and let's give them what they need in terms of public facilities. And so that's what his team did, and this whole space has been activated. It's become a wonderful neighborhood, not that different from the great hill towns of Italy. Very vibrant. A decade or two earlier, you would not have seen a single person on this street. We had a great time relaxing as we toured this area with the architects. A much more positive example of a library park. There were 5 library parks built. 124 schools were built from scratch or renovated. And the mass transit system connected everyone together. This library park is exceptional for what you see as the connection to the neighborhood over here. There is no barrier. This is their living room. This is where people hang out when they get off of work or come home from school. The library itself blurs the distinction between inside and outside. The openness is absolutely remarkable in terms of how welcoming it is. And you can see that there is no barrier, there is no security concern. This library truly belongs to the people. It is a source of great pride and joy. The people are given their dignity. Some of the other brilliant architecture of Medellin. This is the Botanical Gardens, one of the most stunning pieces of architecture done anywhere in the past decade or so. The Museum of Science, the Explora, experiencing the phenomena of science hands-on for yourself. It's an indoor exploration park and an outdoor, and it is extremely popular. There it is in the architectural photo without the people. The interesting thing is the juxtaposition of the housing and the library parks is very intimate, very close, very, very much linked, and it is the key thing. When Fajardo came to North America, the first place he came was the Wentworth Institute of Technology, a disappointingly poorly attended event, but he came at the point when he was running for president of Colombia, and he told the story of the moving from fear to hope. And he emphasized that despite the important role of architecture, architecture is not the point. The point is social policy. The point was stopping the corruption that stole hundreds of millions of dollars away from the people year after year. And he ran on a policy of, I will not steal your money. And he made good on that policy. And instead of stealing the money, he spent hundreds of millions of dollars on parks, mass transit, connecting these people, schools. It was first and foremost a program of education. The slogan of his campaign and of his administration was Medellin the most educated. Of course, everyone knew that Medellin was not the most educated society in Latin America, but it was something to aspire to. That was the social transformation. It was based on education more than anything else. And what he needed to do was distinguish himself between all the other politicians who would say the same thing, that I'm going to create a social transformation, I'm going to fix the schools, and I'm going to educate the masses. He had credibility because he was able to immediately manifest a physical transformation through architectural interventions and interventions in the built environment of Medellin that suddenly gave him an enormous amount of credibility. It was the demonstration effect of this. It was the Missouri rules of political policy and social transformation. And so we, juxtaposing these images, we see world-class architecture in both cases, arguably excellent design, but the difference being, in one case, it is completely isolated away from each other. In the other case, it is completely integrated. It is owned by, of, and for the people of the society, and the difference is night and day. Whereas Medellin used to be the most hostile and dangerous place in the world, it is now a wonderful place to be, and extremely safe. We felt very safe walking around here when we visited. And so that's the kind of transformation that we hope to see much, much more of as architecture stops marginalizing itself through claims of autonomy and disdain for engaging in real problems of the world, and gets over itself in a way and moves into beyond the false dichotomy. It used to be that when I was going to school, you could either solve problems or you could do good design. But if you were trying to use good design to solve real problems, even if it was excellent design, it was somehow suspect. There was something wrong. And this was largely the legacy of the failed efforts of design in public housing in the United States. No one told the architects of Latin America that you could not solve problems, or that you should not, or that you were not allowed to solve real problems for real people with good design. And so they naively ventured forth and did it anyway. And now we're starting to learn the lessons from them. And I'm happy to report that all signs indicate, not just from the Venice Biennale last year, but from the attitudes and assumptions of young architectural students and young professionals, seem much more comfortable actually addressing real problems through design.